The strange calm before kickoff had a different tone this week, the kind that makes you tilt the head and wonder if the universe was finally giving the Miami Dolphins a break or a penis preparando, terreno para algo inesperado. Nothing dramatic, no late-night panic, no avalanche of bad updates. Just a rare alignment where everyone who needed to be available somehow was, though it did not unfold in the smooth, reassuring way one would assume. There was the situation with Aaron Brewer, for instance. His name sitting on the injury report, with ankle, neck, and knee concerns looked more like the aftermath of a wrestling match than preparation for Week 14. For a moment, there was a quiet suspicion lingering around the facility. Would he actually be ready? Or was this one of those weeks where the dominoes fall in slow motion until the offensive line is shuffled again and the team has to pretend it isn't a big deal? Brewer being labeled questionable never felt fully honest. Questionable how? Questionable like he'll push through it. Or questionable like this whole thing could unravel by morning? And then came the move that made everyone pause. Keon Smith elevated from the practice squad. Not the dramatic kind of move that sparks debates, but the type that raises eyebrows in silence. If Brewer was truly fine, why the need to bring up Smith? Why now, on a Saturday, when these decisions usually reveal the team's hand more than they intend to? It created a quiet tension, the sort that floats in the room even when no one says a word. Fans started guessing, coaches tightened their lips, and suddenly the status of one center became something like a tiny mystery. But when the inactives were released, the twist wasn't Brewer at all. It was Kendall Lamb. Out. A healthy scratch. The same Kendall Lamb whose presence usually offered a faint sense of security. Instead, the Dolphins rolled with Smith, a move that felt almost contradictory considering Smith was the one waived not too long ago when Austin Jackson was activated from injured reserve. Lamb stayed, Smith left, then somehow Smith returned, elevated at the precise moment people began wondering whether Brewer's body was going to cooperate. How does that make sense? Maybe that's the point. Maybe it isn't supposed to make sense. Maybe the staff decided that if Brewer was good enough to go, the minimal role on field goal duty could fall to Smith rather than Lamb, who would spend the afternoon watching from the sideline. Or maybe they simply didn't know Brewer's true status until the morning light, and when the final assessment came, they pivoted. The Dolphins weren't bothered, at least not outwardly. They looked more relieved than anything else. A fully available roster is a luxury this time of year, especially when the opponent thrives on chaos. The Jets bring turbulence whether they win or lose. It's simply part of their identity. That's why the news on Zach Wilson carried its own kind of intrigue. Illness added him to the injury report on Saturday, and suddenly the Jets were juggling backup options again. But he dressed. He stood ready as the number 2 behind Tua Tagovailoa, with rookie Quinn Ewers tucked into the emergency role. Odd how a quarterback room can feel both stable and precarious, depending on the week. As if that weren't enough, the Dolphins also managed to avoid setbacks with special teams anchor Elijah Campbell and safety Ifeatu Melifonwu. Both questionable, both available, both carrying the subtle weight of players who may not make headlines, but absolutely shape the details that win or lose games. Watching them warm up without hesitation left an unusual sensation. Everything was aligned. When does that ever happen? And what does it usually mean when it does? Then there were the other inactives. A.J. Green III, Andre Carter II, Taj Washington, Matthew Butler. Each a decision that said more about circumstance than performance. Carter's name stood out, though. He hasn't been active since the Dolphins signed him from Detroit's practice squad. That move was supposed to compensate for the departure of Jaylon Phillips, a change that still echoes every time someone mentions the pass rush. Yet Carter continues waiting, preparing, hanging in that strange limbo where a player is technically part of the team but hasn't been unleashed. What does a week feel like for someone in that position? How long until that door opens, if it ever opens at all? Somewhere in that list, buried between the expected and the unexpected, is the quiet decision that shapes the emotional rhythm of a game day. Lamb sitting, Smith stepping in, Brewer pushing through. It paints a picture of a team that has learned to walk the tightrope between worry and confidence. Not because they enjoy it, but because that's simply how this season has unfolded. Nothing straightforward, nothing predictable. But if the Dolphins' inactive list left room for speculation, The Jets' situation felt like a different story entirely. Justin Fields out again. The Jets wanted him available, needed him even, but the knee injury shut the door. And when that door closed, Brady Cook stepped through it, not dramatically, not with grand expectations, just with the quiet acceptance of someone whose name suddenly matters more than it did the day before. Imagine being thrown into that role on a weekend when the fan base is already uneasy, when the team has lived an entire season balancing chaos and hope with inconsistent results. Cook's promotion was less about opportunity and more about necessity. Safety Tony Adams also disappeared from the list of available players, downgraded until he was effectively erased from the equation. His absence feels subtle on the surface, but carries weight underneath. The Jets' defense relies on stability at the back end, and losing Adams shifts that balance in a way that might not be obvious until a play breaks open downfield and people start asking themselves if things would have looked different had he been active. And then came the rest. Tyler Johnson, Ja'Sir Taylor, Braden McGregor, Motzie Smith, Jelani Woods. Each name an answer to a question. Each inactive another piece removed from a puzzle that was already missing edges. For a franchise so accustomed to rotating players in and out of availability, the pattern felt familiar, almost expected. Yet every missing piece subtly shifts what the Jets can and cannot do, especially against a Dolphins team finally heading into a game with a clean bill of health. Still, something about the day felt unusual. Maybe it was the lack of injury-related drama. Maybe it was the sense that both teams entered this matchup carrying storylines waiting to snap. Maybe it was the way Brewers' availability sent a ripple effect across the offensive line, shaping roles, reshaping expectations, and leaving fans wondering why a decision that seemed simple suddenly had so many layers. Even the quiet roster maneuvers, Smith up, Lamb down, Carter waiting, Fields out, Cook in, formed an undercurrent of tension that wasn't fully visible unless you stopped and looked closely. Why does a routine pregame report feel like it carries more weight than the numbers suggest? Why does the presence or absence of one lineman or one safety shift the emotional landscape of a game that hasn't even started? Maybe because at this point in the season, nothing is small. Nothing is meaningless. Every decision hints at something larger, sometimes clarity, sometimes uncertainty. The Dolphins walked into Week 14 with something they haven't had much lately: options. Real ones. Healthy ones. And that can be unsettling in its own way. When you're used to compensating for injuries, adjusting on the fly, and bracing for unpredictable moments, a fully available roster feels almost suspicious. Like the calm before a storm you can't quite identify. The Jets, meanwhile, entered with a different type of uncertainty. Not about availability, but about identity. Who steps up when the lineup shifts? Who fills the empty spaces left by injuries that always seem mistimed? Who becomes the unexpected factor when the expected ones disappear? Both teams arrived at the same place from completely different paths. One carried steadiness that felt too rare. The other carried turbulence that felt too familiar. And somewhere in the space between those realities, the matchup began to take shape long before the coin toss. Nothing about this game needed drama to make it significant. The tension was already built into the circumstances, the decisions, the names on each list. Some players stepped in, some stepped aside, some waited for a chance that still hasn't arrived. And through all of it, the Dolphins found themselves standing in a place they haven't been often, fully armed, fully prepared, fully intact. At least for now. The question lingering in the air felt impossible to ignore. When everything is finally aligned, what happens next?